As an advisor of big political leaders, what would you advise now? What could be a European way or a European answer beyond traveling to Silicon Valley, wearing T-shirts and behave like a startup?
Well, ultimately, I think Europe has to recognize that unless it becomes serious about the challenges posed to its economic and political model by what I call data extractivism, and by the shift towards artificial intelligence as the key intermediary of virtually every single industry, Europe will become a technological colony of the United States or China. When those are the only two big centers of power where things like AI are taken seriously and given the proper protection, investment, and so forth. So if Europe is really serious, it really has to understand that without having a robust approach to creating its own data-intensive AI and data-intensive set of industries, it will become increasingly reliant on the Chinese or the Americans. So that requires some kind of an industrial strategy as it applies to the AI and data. It requires rethinking a lot of the previously articulated commitments to the free trade in data and services. Now if you really want to erect some barriers in the flow of trade, in the flow of data on its way to American servers, you actually will not be able to do that, right? So, it doesn't have to be data nationalism. You can use much nicer terms like data localization. And there is absolutely nothing, to me, jingoistic or nationalistic about people actually not wanting the data to be harvested and contributing to the political economy and the actual economy of the United States as opposed to the local economy in their city, in their town. It doesn't have to imply any kind of nationalistic attitudes towards data, but ultimately you have to find ways in which you can build things, right, with your own resources. If all of your resources end up elsewhere, it's going to be very hard. So ultimately it requires a somewhat different political and economic orientation, right? And that of course presupposes that our leaders have a good, sharp vision of where the world is going. And unfortunately, most of the talking points we hear in Europe, propounded, and promoted by European politicians, they will articulate a vision of the digital single market, but that's kind of beyond the point, because if there is nobody in that market capable of offering any advanced AI services, what's the point of a digital single market, right? You can't beat sophisticated Chinese AI systems with low roaming fees. It's not an adequate response to the nature of the challenge.
And imagine we don't find an industrial policy to answer that. So you mentioned that we will become a digital colony of the US and China. What happens to Europe then?
Well, in Europe we'll have to be very clever at playing them off each other. And ultimately, I come from a kind of like Belarus, which has survived for the last 20 years by playing Russia and the European Union off each other. And it has worked for 20 years. I don't know whether it will work in Europe, but ultimately, look, I think for the short term, we might think that nothing drastic is happening, that everything is okay, because ultimately underlying this shift and emergence of what I call data extractivism is a process of distributing a lot of services for free or deeply subsidized, because you actually need to offer services for free to get people to give away their data. Right? And you can extend that model that currently covers activities like search or social networking or sharing of videos. You can kind of expand it further. You can run education on that model, you can run healthcare on that model, you can run transportation on that model, but for a limited period of time. Because ultimately, you did not invent somehow a new parallel welfare state that will just be funded by companies and will continue forever. These companies are going to run those services for a short period of time. Once they're done with data extractivism, they're going to leave it. And then the question becomes, who's going to pay for the provision of those services that we take for granted? Imagine Google no longer wants to subsidize the provision of search. How are we going to find the information? How are we going to find academic articles, books, and so forth? We don't have plan B, right? And this is what bothers me the most, that, we're not talking about developing world, we're not talking about Cambodia or Vietnam, where there are no resources to build plan B. In Europe, there are still billions going to research initiatives.
So we are naive. Sorry, we're a little bit naive Europeans. So.
Well, unfortunately, it's not just naivete. It's the fact that there are power struggles also how to distribute this research funding, right? And a lot of it ends up going to Europe's incumbent players in the telecom industry and so forth, and they prosper and survive, but they don't innovate because they receive the stream of funding coming from the European Commission.
There are a lot of entrepreneurs, company owners in Europe coming from basically building great hardware. Mm-hmm. What would you advise from your perspective they have to invest in, with whom they should partner? What could be really, from an entrepreneurial point of view, a good way to leap from the German or European companies on that big data?
Yeah. Well, I don't think I'm revealing any secrets, but I think hardware, we all know, is becoming commoditized, like many other products. And once it becomes commoditized, you can't really continue expecting to get the high margins that you have traditionally got when it was not commoditized, right? And that, I think, explains quite a lot about the transformation of the global economy since the 1960s. Once it was just the Americans that were building this high-value hardware engineering products, then it became the Germans and the Japanese, then it became Southeast Asia, then it became China, and now, unless you can beat the Chinese price, you will not stay in business for a very long time. But it also means that your margins are being eroded, right? And ultimately, I think the challenge for a lot of the entrepreneurs that committed themselves to being in the hardware business is that once the devices that they build, once the machines that they build acquire this extra level of intelligence that comes from software, they have to start sharing power with whoever builds the software. And if software is a higher margin business, and you can argue that even software is getting commoditized, right? And everything is getting commoditized, but ultimately there is always a level where somebody still exerts ultimate control over the rest of the stack, right? And right now it seems to me that regardless of from what perspective you look at the issue, that control revolves around data in one way or another, whether it's from AI, artificial intelligence services being built with that data, or whether it comes from some kind of extra level of data analytics, or whether it comes from some kind of service sold on top of the hardware. I mean, ultimately, unless you control that level, you are at the mercy of somebody else. Mm-hmm. So I would not be faithful to my own message if I would assure people engaged in hardware manufacturing that everything is calm and they shouldn't worry. I mean, they should worry, and ultimately they should understand that a lot of big hardware manufacturers, you look at Rolls-Royce and many others, ultimately they make money from services at this point. They do not make money from just selling hardware, right? They make sure that maintenance and everything else is priced into the services that they sell. So you're not just buying an engine, you're buying actually something that will be serviced and will offer you a particular level of functionality, right? So once the paradigm has shifted so radically, unless you get control of the data and the sensors, the smart infrastructure built on top of hardware that was previously done, you're at the mercy of someone else.